This is the 2018 AP English Language and Composition FRQ synthesis essay. We look over our prompt. We remember that we have 40 minutes in which to actually write the essay and the additional 15 in which to read, annotate, and plan. Eminent domain is the power governments have to acquire property from private owners for public use. The rationale behind eminent domain is that governments have greater legal authority over lands within their dominion than do private owners. Eminent domain has been instituted in one way or another throughout the world for hundreds of years. So we have our context. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Then synthesize material from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-developed essay that defends, challenges, or qualifies the notion that eminent domain is productive and beneficial. Okay, so here we're actually using the same sort of language that we would take from our argument essays. And we're being asked to take one of these positions regarding the notion that eminent domain is productive and beneficial. So are we going to agree, are we going to disagree, or are we going to qualify? I like for you to have a general idea of what your response might be going into the sources. For me, I'm going to qualify because I'm going to say that there are some benefits. You know, maybe we need to commandeer property or land because of some sort of emergency. But also negative because of the potential for abuse. Your argument should be the focus of your essay. Use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources you are drawing from, whether direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. And as we know, we are going to stick to letter format only. So let's look at this first source. Of course, we want to check out the background information, the context for the source. This is from the U.S. Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division, and it's the history of the federal use of eminent domain. So probably going to have a more positive slant here, but let's see. The federal government's power of eminent domain has long been used in the United States to acquire property for public use, so everyone benefits. Eminent domain appertains to every independent government. It requires no constitutional recognition. It is an attribute of sovereignty. Boom, Colorado versus Patterson, 98 U.S. 403-406. However, the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution stipulates, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Thus, whenever the United States acquires a property through eminent domain, it has a constitutional responsibility to justly compensate the property owner for the fair market value of the property. The U.S. Supreme Court first examined federal eminent domain power in 1876 in Cole versus United States. This case presented a landowner's challenge to the power of the United States to condemn land in Cincinnati, Ohio, for use as a custom house and post office building. Justice William Strong called the authority of the federal government to appropriate property for public uses essential to its independent existence and perpetuity. The Supreme Court again acknowledged the existence of condemnation authority 20 years later in United States versus Gettysburg Electric Railroad Company. Congress wanted to acquire land to preserve the site of the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania. Okay, so we're trying to preserve some historical site. So I'm just going to put historical preservation. The railroad company that owned some of the property in question contested this action. Ultimately, the court opined that the federal government has the power to condemn property whenever it is necessary or appropriate to use the land in the execution of any of the powers granted to it by the Constitution. Eminent domain has been utilized traditionally to facilitate transportation, supply water, construct public buildings, and aid in defense readiness. Early federal cases condemned property for construction of public buildings and aqueducts to provide cities with drinking water, for maintenance of navigable waters, and for the production of war materials. The land acquisition section and its earlier iterations represented the United States in these cases, thereby playing a central role in early United States infrastructure projects. Condemnation cases like that against the Gettysburg Railroad Company exemplify another use for eminent domain, establishing parks and setting aside open space for future generations, preserving places of historic interest, and remarkable natural beauty, and protecting environmentally sensitive areas. So I'm going to put positive benefits of eminent domain. Some of the earliest federal government acquisitions for parkland were made at the end of the 19th century and remain among the most beloved and well-used of American parks. In Washington, D.C., Congress authorized the creation of a park along Rock Creek in 1890 for the enjoyment of the capital city's residents and visitors. The Department of Justice became involved when a number of landowners from whom property was to be acquired disputed the constitutionality of the condemnation. In Shoemaker versus United States, the Supreme Court affirmed the actions of Congress. Today, Rock Creek National Park, over a century old and more than twice the size of New York City's Central Park, remains a unique wilderness in the midst of an urban environment. This is merely one small example of the many federal parks, preserves, historic sites, and monuments to which the work of the Land Acquisition section has contributed. So for source A, we're going to use the plus sign because this is in favor of eminent domain, and we're just going to put ED equals parks slash, and I'm just going to write history. Remember that you want to use any paraphrase that makes sense to you. It might not precisely match up with the sorts of words or phrases or abbreviations that I use, but it's just got to make sense to you to serve as that reminder when you're organizing your sources. Now we have an excerpt that is from a, looks like, article titled Eminent Domain Often Leaves Communities Broken. So we know that this is probably going to be rather negative. Let's see. Weeds and rubble cover 90 acres along Long Island Sound. A room with cinder block walls sits locked in an empty Brooklyn basement. And a gleaming industrial palace has failed to bring jobs to the banks of Ohio's Mahoning River. These are monuments to failed central planning. So let's go ahead and mark that. Eminent domain, state and local subsidies, and federal corporate partnerships have yielded these lifeless fruits, failing to deliver the rebirth, community benefits, and jobs they promise, but succeeding in delivering profits to the companies that lobby for them. So that seems major, this part right here, succeeding in delivering profits, because it's going to suggest that eminent domain is less about preservation and more about money. So I'm just going to write ED equals money. The economic philosophy at work here isn't capitalism or socialism, it's corporatism, the belief that government and business should work together. You could describe corporatism as the view that profits provided by the market aren't sufficient motivation for business, so government must put some icing on top. From another perspective, corporatism is government's attempt to harness the profit motive for the goals of policymakers. Let industry row the ship while politicians steer. Often, the corporatist ship founders on the rocks of false promises. Okay, so some really good imagery here of how the ship is sent off to do what it's supposed to do, but it founders, right? It's not going to work. I think that we should circle false promises and write maybe, you know, politics, government, business, greed. This whole idea, oh yeah, I'm just going to take your land and do something really great with it, and then it becomes a lifeless fruit. Last decade, the New London Development Corporation, a quasi-governmental body, crafted a plan for revitalizing the small Connecticut town. This plan involved a new Pfizer plant. The NLDC and local politicians sold the land to Pfizer for $10, gave the company tax breaks, and pledged $26 million to clean up contamination and a local junkyard. Pfizer wants a nice place to operate, the Hartford Courant quoted executive David Burnett as saying in 2001. But Burnett wasn't just talking about the junkyard and the contamination. He was also talking about the area's middle-class homes. We don't want to be surrounded by tenements. So NLDC drove out the homeowners using eminent domain. Homeowner Suzette Kelo sued, but in the end, the liberal majority on the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the developers and the politicians. The majority argued the city has carefully formulated a development plan that it believes will provide appreciable benefits to the community, including, but not limited to, new jobs and increased tax revenue. The New York Times applauded the ruling. New London's development plan may hurt a few small property owners who will, in any case, be fully compensated. But many more residents are likely to benefit if the city can shore up its tax base and attract badly needed jobs. In 2009, Pfizer, after its merger with Wyeth, abandoned its plant in New London. The condemned neighborhood is now, as Charlotte Allen put it in the Weekly Standard, a vast empty field, 90 acres, that was entirely uninhabited and looked as though it had always been that way. On the bright side, Pfizer got to sell the plant to General Dynamics for $55 million. So here we are getting a sort of negative perspective that eminent domain can be fruitless and about money. Source C. One of the things I want you to notice, we've had fairly lengthy sources, A, B, and now C. When that happens, they're usually balanced at some point with either a chart, a graph, or a comic. So I'm sure we'll have one of those coming up. This comes from a blog from a law professor, and it's titled How Eminent Domain Abuse Harms the Poor. So we're going to get another negative perspective, it sounds like. This June is the 10th anniversary of Kelo versus the City of New London. The controversial Supreme Court decision held that it is permissible for the government to use eminent domain to take private property and transfer it to other private interests in order to promote economic development. Not surprisingly, the ruling was opposed by libertarians and conservatives because it undermines property rights. But it has also met with strong criticism from many on the left, including Ralph Nader, the NAACP, and former President Bill Clinton. This unusual cross-ideological coalition arose because takings that transfer property to private interests often tend to victimize the poor, racial minorities, and the politically weak. As Hillary Shelton of the NAACP put it in testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, allowing municipalities to pursue eminent domain for private economic development has a disparate impact on African Americans and other minorities. So this disparate impact is something that we want to pay attention to. His point is backed by much painful historical experience. Since the 1940s, blight, urban renewal, and economic development takings have forcibly displaced several million people in the United States, most of them poor and racial minorities. That's pretty strong wording there. Most of the people displaced were left even worse off than they were before. The condemned property was often transferred to politically influential developers and business interests. While such condemnations are less common in recent years, blight takings still disproportionately occur in poor and minority neighborhoods and still inflict great harm both on the victims and on the surrounding communities. Unlike in the 1940s and 50s, overt racism is rarely a factor in modern takings, though some scholars contend that unconscious bias plays a role. In most cases, the poor and minorities suffer not because officials are hostile to them as such, but because these groups often lack the resources and political influence to resist effectively, especially when faced with more powerful interest groups on the other side. Defenders of blight and economic development takings argue that they are a necessary tool for promoting economic growth in poor areas. But in reality, such condemnations often destroy far more economic value than they create. So that's interesting. So it can have the inverse effect of what is intended. That might be one reason that we argue eminent domain is not beneficial. Developers and local governments have strong incentives to overstate the benefits of condemnation-driven projects and ignore costs. By the time their true effects become evident years later, public attention has usually moved on to other issues. Voters rarely punish officials who authorize dubious takings. In the Kelo case itself, the condemned property remains empty a decade after the Supreme Court decision. Cities that make aggressive use of eminent domain to promote private development projects often end up undermining their economies rather than enhancing them. That's exactly what we just said, so let's go ahead and make sure we note that. I didn't mean to cross it out. So ED can actually have inverse effects. The bankrupt city of Detroit is a striking case in point. For many years, Detroit made extensive use of takings for the benefit of politically connected business interests. In the notorious 1981 Poletown case, it forcibly displaced some 4,000 people and numerous businesses in order to transfer the property to General Motors for the construction of a new factory. That taking failed to provide anything close to the promised 6,000 new jobs. The destruction of numerous homes, businesses, and schools, and churches predictably damaged the local economy. Ultimately, eminent domain abuse was a significant contributor to the city's economic decline. Aggressive use of eminent domain also damages the social fabric of poor communities because the displacement of residents, businesses, and churches undermines social ties. So definitely going to put up here negative, and then we're going to put abuses / minority impact. Source D. This is from a case study excerpted from a report by a nonprofit research and education organization specializing in land use and real estate development. The Freetown neighborhood in Greenville was developed in the 1880s. The neighborhood declined over the years. Housing became little more than shacks, and cracked sidewalks and worn pavement were the norm. Residents appealed to the Greene County Redevelopment Authority for help. Today, Freetown is a different place after undergoing a complete makeover that replaced decaying housing and junk-strewn lots with 80 affordable new homes and 10 rehabilitated residences. Neighborhood street, water, and sewer infrastructure also was upgraded. One of the most dramatic improvements is a new $600,000 community center equipped with a full-size gymnasium, meeting rooms, and a kitchen that replaced a small U.S. Army barracks building previously used as the neighborhood center. So we're just going to put upgrades. The Redevelopment Authority accomplished all this beginning in 1998 by acquiring blighted properties in order to assemble buildable sites for new homes. Acquisitions included a 54-unit apartment complex that was torn down and replaced by more than a dozen new single-family homes. Most new houses in Freetown have about 1,100 square feet of space and are valued at less than $75,000. So here we'll put affordable. The authority used the power of eminent domain to acquire only 2 holdout properties and to clear title to abandoned and tax delinquent properties. Relocation grants ranging from $10,000 to $20,000 helped residents make down payments on new homes. Having completed a carefully phased redevelopment program in 2006, the authority successfully returned more than 1/3 of the displaced households to the Freetown community, which now numbers about 200 families. Okay, so here we have something that's skewed in a more positive direction, and we are learning how eminent domain can improve communities. Source E, here is the promised comic. It says that this following cartoon was published in a nationally syndicated comic strip, and we have a guest artist. It says, having defeated the wolf, the 3 little pigs lose their house to a greater foe. And then it shows the little pigs. One says, what the heck's eminent domain? And the other says, what the heck's a Walmart? So this kind of speaks to the struggle for maybe like private home ownership. And one thing you might pursue with this, this is the American dream, right? To own your home. So I'm just putting that because if you haven't connected that, or if it hasn't come to mind as we're reading through these sources, certainly could be a direction that you pursue for your essay. Versus, let's go back to corporate greed. Hello, Walmart. Now, as far as I know, there's not just one Walmart. There's a joke that they've become like the Starbucks, where there's one on every corner. They're also available online for online purchases. So why do you need to take someone's home and seize it, tear it down so that you can build a Walmart? On the opposite side, if you're going to be defending eminent domain, a house serves one family, but a Walmart serves thousands of families. So this is the other side of the argument. I personally would not waste your time looking at both sides if you know specifically the direction that you're going. But you should at least be aware, especially with your visual sources, your graphs, your charts, and certainly your cartoons, that they can be interpreted a multitude of ways, okay? Oh, I'm so sorry. We didn't do our little paraphrase at the top. Let's go ahead and put a negative up here. Eminent domain equals beyond citizen control, right? The poor little piggies can't do anything against the Walmart. So we get to source F. 1 mile equals $595,625. Jury decides. That sounds interesting. This was published in a local newspaper. And it says, when Canal Winchester offered Richard Pete Steebelton $9,249 for a 1 mile strip of his property, Steebelton thought the payment was too low. Boy, was it ever. This month, a Franklin County Common Pleas jury decided the village should pay the farmer and used car dealer $595,625. Canal Winchester wants the land to link a bike path between Rager Road and the village swimming pool. It used eminent domain to take a strip of Steebelton's 80-acre property and hired an appraiser who determined that the $9,249 would be enough compensation. It wasn't fair at all, Steebelton, 75, remembers thinking. Steebelton was the only one of 8 property owners who didn't agree to sell his land to the village for the path. Instead, he went to court to challenge the village's valuation. The jury decided September 20th that the land the village wants along the northern edge of his property is worth $37,000. But the jury also decided that by taking it, the village was closing off a back entrance to the property and damaging the value of the rest of Steebelton's land by $558,625. I was thrilled. I would have to be, Steebelton said of the victory, adding that the trial put me through one hell of a miserable week. Steebelton lives in a home built in 1825, so you talk about historical value. He grows hay and raises horses on the land he bought 21 years ago for $300,000. So this really has become both his home and his livelihood. So we'll just put income there. Canal Winchester's former mayor, Marshall Hall, offered Steebelton $60,000 years ago, but Steebelton turned that down. Hall was replaced by Mayor Jeff Miller 4 years ago. Steebelton was offered the $9,249 as part of a deal in which the Ohio Department of Transportation agreed to finance 80% of construction costs for the $1.57 million bike path project. Now the project might be on hold, Miller said. We're really at the mercy of the ODOT, Miller said. They're going to decide where we go with it. ODOT spokesman Joel Hunt said the agency will work with the village to move the project forward and seek alternative routes if necessary. One option is to pay Steebelton the full jury award and move ahead. Another is to pay Steebelton the $37,000 and work out an alternate path that doesn't diminish the value of Steebelton's land, said Gene Hollins, the village solicitor. I think the council and mayor are very well-meaning people trying to carry out what would be a very nice bike path, which we've invested a good deal of effort in, Hollins said. So this one, we could look at both positive and negative on this side because it's showing us how eminent domain can get messy. The courts, the court costs, the different valuations awarded by the jury can be a little bit more complicated than maybe what the government would actually want. Okay. All right. So that takes us through. And we want to make sure now that we're going to be able to correctly answer the essay question, okay? So the question at the start was the task was to develop an essay that defends, challenges, or qualifies the notion that eminent domain is productive and beneficial. If you need to pause and go back and look at the screen, please do. But productive and beneficial are the key terms when we determine our position. As I said going in, I think I'm going to qualify it. And so my working thesis, I want to look at the potential for abuse, but also the potential to need the land for maybe emergencies or to improve the community, things like that. Okay. So I'm going to write as my working thesis, in certain cases, eminent domain can prove beneficial. Remember, I like to use the words from the prompt by improving or helping communities in crisis. But this does not negate that left unchecked eminent domain policies and practices, this is where I want to talk about abuse, can be, let's say, harshly abused. I don't know if I love that, but again, it's a working thesis, so I can refine it when I answer this. Okay, so I've got a working thesis. I'm qualifying. I'm saying in some cases it can prove beneficial, but that doesn't mean just because there's some benefit involved that it doesn't also have that potential for abuse. So I'd like to do the 5 body paragraphs for the synthesis. My body paragraph number 1 is going to focus on the beneficial, productive nature of ED. So, okay. And I do mean eminent domain. What might we want to write about here? We might write about uplifting blighted communities. So uplift blighted communities. We might want to talk about establishing community centers, which can themselves be really valuable resources for a community. And then we might even talk about emergency acquisition. And that could be something in terms of, you know, maybe there's a hurricane and critical infrastructure has been damaged beyond repair, so we need to seize new lands to rebuild and serve the community that way. What sources might we be able to cite from here? Well, certainly for uplifting the blighted community, we would probably want to cite from source D, and establishing community centers, we could get that from the very first source that really talks about the various benefits of eminent domain. In body paragraph number 2, we now want to look at potential abuse. And here we might write about eminent domain used for corporate greed. And there are a few different sources that we might want to quote from this one. I actually might use E, the 3 little piggies there. Another thing that we might put, it can negatively affect or disproportionately affect minority groups. And we would want to go ahead and cite from C there, okay? So right away, we already have 4 different sources. And even though you are always asked to use at least 3, it's really good if you're able to use at least 4, okay? So then what should we do for our 3rd body paragraph? Well, if we're qualifying, and the way that we've set this up, we've got 1 paragraph about the benefits, another paragraph about the potential abuses. Now we need to have some sort of reconciliation of the 2 so that we know how are we going to view eminent domain? What is our position overall? We've noted that there could be productive, beneficial aspects of eminent domain. We've noted that there can be abuses of eminent domain policies. So now we have to come up with our best policy. What might be the best policy for eminent domain moving forward? And it would be to ensure that eminent domain is productive, we're going to borrow those words from the prompt again, and beneficial to the community. And to do that, it should be policed by the judiciary. And that way you can ensure that, for example, with source F, that you're getting fair compensation. Or maybe you want to go back to source A, that the eminent domain actually is going to serve the community. Okay, so that's how you might lay out a possible response to this synthesis essay. Make sure that you use the sources to clearly defend your position. Okay, good luck. Bye-bye.